the story of the FMAIAE-33. Pulqui 2 jet fighter began in Argentina in the late 1940s under President Juan Perón. In the indigenous Mapuche language, Pulqui translates to arrow. This ambitious aircraft was designed by the renowned aerospace engineer Kurt Tank and built at the state-run military aircraft factory. The new fighter was heavily based on design concepts from an unrealized German World War II project, the Focke-Wulf TA-183. The Argentine military hoped this new Arrow would be a capable replacement for the British Gloster Meteor F-4 fighters serving in their air force at the time. But the aircraft's path to the skies was incredibly long and plagued with setbacks. Development dragged on, and out of the 4 prototypes built, 2 were lost in fatal test flights. Interestingly, one prototype actually saw combat during the 1955 Revolución Libertadora. But despite this brief operational success, the project was constantly bogged down, facing a barrage of political, economic, and technical issues. Consequently, the FMAIAE-33 never really got the chance to prove its true potential. Ultimately, the Argentine government pulled the plug, choosing not to pour massive capital into refining their domestic fighter for mass production. Instead, they opted to buy surplus American F-86 Sabres. So how did Argentina end up building its own jet aircraft in the first place? In the late 1940s, the country gained a massive edge by actively recruiting prominent aviation scientists and engineers. Many of these specialists were fleeing the ruins of post-war Europe, looking for a safe haven in Latin America. Among this first wave of expats was the French aircraft designer Émile de Watine, who was facing severe consequences back home for collaborating with the occupation regime. He spearheaded the experimental program to build Argentina's first jet fighter, the IAE-27 Pulqui 1. Working right alongside him was a talented team of Argentine engineers, including Juan Ignacio San Martín, Enrique Cardellac, and Norberto Luis Morquio. Their combined brainchild went down in history as the very first jet aircraft designed and built entirely in Latin America. The triumph was short-lived, however. Flight testing in 1947 yielded mediocre performance, with a top speed of only about 450 miles per hour, and the first Aero program was eventually scrapped. But the Aviation Institute, led by Morquio, wasn't ready to give up just yet. They were determined to build a successful domestic aircraft. Initially, they tried to just upgrade that unsuccessful early airframe. Once the engineers realized the original variant had maxed out its potential, the Institute launched a clean sheet design. This time around, they decided to go with a much more powerful British turbojet engine. They chose the Rolls-Royce Nini 2, which cranked out an impressive 5,000 pounds of thrust. In early 1948, the team completed a scale model of the aircraft that would later become the IAE-27A Pulqui 2. This concept featured a distinctive trapezoidal wing with a 33-degree sweep. It also had an aerodynamic profile that was cutting edge for the time, significantly reducing drag. Later that same year, the design got a major overhaul. The wing was moved high up on the fuselage, and the empennage was reshaped into that iconic T-tail configuration. Right around that same time, another heavy hitter in the aviation world was brought on board to help develop the Argentine fighter. This was the previously mentioned German designer Kurt Tank, who had formerly served as the technical director for the legendary aircraft manufacturer Focke-Wulf. Along with a group of 62 of his former employees, Tank crossed the Atlantic to start a new chapter in his career, focusing on bold and risky aviation projects. His arrival was steeped in secrecy. The engineer entered the country using a fake passport under the alias Pedro Matus. However, the local authorities welcomed him so warmly that the need to maintain his cover story quickly faded. Together with his team of German specialists, he played a key role in transforming a modest aviation institute in Córdoba into the massive military aviation factory. It is worth noting that Kurt Tank was not just a brilliant engineer, he was also an accomplished test pilot, and the man who designed the legendary FW-190 fighter. His design team was also responsible for creating the Focke-Wulf TA-183. This was the aircraft that won the German emergency fighter program competition in 1945. This compact swept wing jet was primarily developed by engineer Hans Multhaup, but World War II ended before they could build a prototype. By the time Germany surrendered, this promising project had only reached the wind tunnel testing phase. Eventually, though, these innovative designs got a second lease on life down in South America. When Kurt Tank took charge of the development program for the new Argentine fighter, he made a major decision. He completely reworked the original TA-183 airframe to accommodate the new and much more powerful British Rolls-Royce Nene 2 engine. As a result, this extensive redesign meant the new aircraft ended up looking only vaguely like its predecessor. The Nene engine was much larger, heavier, and significantly more powerful than the German HES-011 turbojet originally intended for the TA-183. Consequently, the engineers had to completely redesign the fuselage, making it much wider. The main reason for this was that the new engine used a centrifugal flow compressor, which had a much larger diameter than the compact axial flow design of the HES-011. Tank's updated TA-183 design had become very similar to another local project, the IAE-27. Seeing this, the director of the Aviation Institute, Juan Ignacio San Martin, merged the two parallel projects into one, designated the IAE-33 Pulqui 2. To save time and resources, the fuselage from Tank's design was further adapted to accept the existing landing gear from the IAE-27. The aircraft's wings were shoulder-mounted on the fuselage, featuring a negative angle of incidence and an aggressive 40-degree sweepback. This sweepback was even more pronounced than on the original TA-183. The wings also incorporated a noticeable downward slant known as anhedral. The power plant layout stayed true to its predecessor. The massive Nene engine was mounted right behind the cockpit, keeping it very close to the fighter's center of gravity. To make it easier for ground crews to access the engine during maintenance, the entire tail section of the fighter was designed to be removable. Visually, the fighter stood out with an elegant T-tail featuring a 50-degree sweep. The pilot sat in a modern pressurized cockpit enclosed by a clear and streamlined bubble canopy. To protect the pilot in combat, the cockpit was wrapped in armor plating and a thick, armored glass windscreen was installed up front. As for fuel capacity, the main internal fuselage tanks held 330 U.S. gallons, while the auxiliary wing tanks carried another 211 gallons. The fighter's firepower was slated to consist of 4 20mm cannons mounted in the lower fuselage, arranged in staggered pairs on either side of the nose intake. To see how well the IAE-33 design actually worked, they brought another famous expatriate aircraft designer onto the project, Reimar Horten. With his help, 2 unpowered gliders were built between 1948 and 1949 for aerodynamic testing. Kurt Tank himself even took the controls during these tests. The flights revealed some serious lateral stability issues. To fix this flaw before they even started building the full-scale powered prototypes, the engineers had to quickly redesign the tail section. Since Argentina was critically short on modern industrial equipment at the time, manufacturing the all-metal components relied almost entirely on manual labor. This made building the first experimental airframes an incredibly slow and difficult process. President Perón had high hopes, believing that the new aviation plant could mass-produce aircraft on par with the world's leading manufacturers. But Kurt Tank quickly realized the harsh reality. Setting up a modern assembly line at that stage was simply impossible. This forced them to rely mostly on hand assembly. They decided not to fly the first completed airframe at all, using it exclusively for static ground testing, where it was intentionally stressed to the point of destruction. The first fully functional IAE-33 prototype was successfully completed in 1950. On June 27th of that same year, it made its long-awaited first flight with experienced test pilot Captain Edmundo Weiss at the controls. However, real trouble started during the second test flight. Otto Behrens, a former test pilot for Focke-Wulf, ran into a dangerous problem. As his airspeed passed 430 miles per hour, the aircraft began losing stability and became highly erratic. Taking no chances, Behrens immediately aborted the test and returned to base. Because he landed at such a high speed, the fighter bounced hard off the runway, and the impact snapped the right main landing gear strut. While the aircraft was down for repairs, the engineering team decided to fix its unpredictable landing behavior by lengthening the nose gear strut. This increased the aircraft's angle of attack on the ground, and mechanics also adjusted the shock absorbers for a longer, softer stroke. These engineering tweaks paid off. The IAE-33 became much more manageable during takeoff and landing, and handled significantly better at low speeds. But the designer's main headache had not gone anywhere. Major aerodynamic flaws still remained, as the airflow was separating from the wings unevenly, causing the aircraft to yaw unexpectedly and depart from controlled flight. To solve this, engineers had to reshape the wing's leading edge near the wing root, and they reworked the rudder in a desperate attempt to cure the fighter's persistent instability. On top of that, the cockpit canopy was reinforced with 2 external frames, and a small aerodynamic fairing was added above the engine exhaust nozzle. Kurt Tank decided to personally take over the rest of the flight test program, taking on the most dangerous part of the job, evaluating the aircraft's stall and spin characteristics. It took several long months of hard work to integrate all the necessary modifications into the Pulqui 2 design, pushing the third test flight all the way back to October 23rd. When high-altitude testing began, the IAE-33 unexpectedly pitched into an uncontrolled dive twice in a row. Fortunately, Kurt Tank was flying at nearly 29,500 feet. Having that much altitude gave him plenty of room to level out and recover the aircraft. The fix turned out to be surprisingly simple. Engineers just added a bit of ballast to the nose, which eliminated the issue for good. On February 8, 1951, Kurt Tank put on a massive public demonstration of his creation, personally piloting the IAE-33 for President Juan Perón at an airfield right in the heart of Buenos Aires. A huge crowd watched the spectacle, including government officials, politicians, foreign military attachés, and thousands of thrilled spectators. During this grand event, 2 symbols of Argentine aviation took to the skies together: the IAE-27 Pulqui 1 and the IAE-33 Pulqui 2. After the flight demonstrations ended in absolute triumph, the Argentine Air Force immediately ordered a pre-production batch of 12 IAE-33 fighters. Later that year, the military formed a special unit of their top test pilots to evaluate the new jets before they entered active service. However, the optimism quickly faded. On May 31, 1951, during the very first test flight flown by Commander Soto, a major issue emerged. When the jet accelerated to 620 miles per hour, severe and dangerous vibrations shook the entire airframe. Kurt Tank grounded the sole prototype, strictly forbidding anyone from flying it until the engineering team could find and fix the cause. But as is often the case, the chief designer's orders were overruled and testing resumed. Right before the fatal 28th flight, test pilot Captain Vidania Manuel was strongly warned to take it easy and not pull heavy G-forces. A morning sortie had once again triggered the vibrations, and their source was still a mystery. But the ambitious pilot was determined to push the limits. Brushing off his colleagues' warnings, Captain Manuel took the fighter up into the skies over Córdoba that afternoon and started flying aggressive aerobatics. That decision proved tragic. The airframe simply could not handle the extreme structural loads, and the aircraft suffered catastrophic structural failure in mid-air. One of the wings completely sheared off the fuselage. The captain fought for his life all the way down, attempting to fire his Martin Baker Mark I ejection seat. He did manage to eject, but at far too low of an altitude, right as the aircraft rolled inverted. Without enough ground clearance, the parachute did not have time to deploy, and the talented pilot was killed on impact. During the thorough investigation that followed, engineers finally pinpointed the cause of the crash. The fatal flaw came down to the poor manufacturing quality of the Pulqui 2 components, specifically faulty welds on the metal fittings connecting the wing to the fuselage. Because Argentina severely lacked modern, heavy-duty forging and pressing equipment at the time, the factory had to make technical compromises during the welding process. This forced compromise in weld strength cost the pilot his life and brought flight testing of the promising jet to a grinding halt. Right after losing the previous prototype, engineers started building a new one, making a series of major structural changes to fix the flaws uncovered during the first prototype flight tests. They installed a larger rudder to improve directional stability, widened the engine exhaust, and added unique air brakes that flared out from the sides of the aft fuselage. The cockpit was also reinforced and the aircraft's fuel capacity was significantly increased, bumping its range up from about 1,200 to nearly 1,900 miles. The new IAE-33 prototype took to the skies for the first time on September 23, 1952, with Captain Jorge Doyle at the controls. Flight testing resumed, but the program was abruptly rushed to prepare the aircraft for a massive flight demonstration in front of President Juan Perón, scheduled for October of that same year. Test pilot Behrens was assigned to fly the demonstration, but he had serious reservations about the handling characteristics of the Pulqui 2 at various speeds and altitudes. He bluntly reported that it had the worst handling of any aircraft he had flown in his entire career as a test pilot. Those concerns turned out to be tragically well-founded. Just 2 days before the highly anticipated demonstration, during a routine practice flight, the Pulqui 2 flown by Behrens suddenly snapped into a spin at a dangerously low altitude. The result was catastrophic. The prototype was completely destroyed, and the talented pilot was killed. Despite the tragedy, development continued, and in 1953, Kurt Tank built the next prototype. To once and for all solve the deadly pitch up and stall issues, engineers added aerodynamic wing fences and 4 fixed strakes to the tail section. On top of that, the cockpit was finally pressurized and fuel capacity was increased yet again. Notably, this variant was the first to be fully equipped with live weapons featuring 4 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS-404 aviation cannons. Lieutenant Conan Doyle took this updated IAE-33 into the air for the first time on August 20, 1953. By the following year, he, along with Lieutenants Gonzalez and Balado, began active live fire testing to evaluate its combat capabilities. While the design team was conceptualizing a radar-equipped all-weather version of the IAE-33, the Argentine Air Force was already making ambitious plans, hoping to order a production run of 100 Pulqui 2 fighters right out of the gate. Their goal was to evolve the aircraft into a true interceptor by installing an afterburning Rolls-Royce Nene engine, projected to push the fighter to Mach 0.98, right on the edge of the sound barrier. The design looked so promising that it attracted international attention, with the Netherlands expressing interest in 1951, followed by Egypt in 1953. However, Argentina could not provide a firm timeline for when full-scale mass production would actually begin, which scared off foreign buyers. Both countries ultimately opted for proven, off-the-shelf fighters instead. Ultimately, the story of the IAE-33 Pulqui 2 project was inextricably linked to political maneuvering and the turbulent fate of the Juan Perón regime. Even though the primary military aviation plant of the country was tasked with finalizing the fighter for production, constant political meddling created absolute chaos and endless delays. Complicating matters further, Kurt Tank's team could not dedicate all their resources to a single fighter. They were simultaneously developing the FMAIAE-35 Huancairo, a twin-engine multi-role aircraft intended to serve as a transport, trainer, and reconnaissance plane. But the most devastating setback came from a sudden government decision. Practically overnight, the entire production program shifted toward building cars and agricultural equipment, essentially pulling the plug on any meaningful work in the aviation division. Internal competition for resources meant that tractors and cars started bleeding the Pulqui 2 project dry of its last remaining time, funding, and skilled personnel. At the time, Argentina's economy was going through a seriously rough patch. After a severe economic crisis in 1953, the country's finances were completely drained. But the fatal blow to the new jet's development hit in January 1955 when chief designer Kurt Tank's contract expired. Rumor had it he demanded double his fee to stay on board, but President Perón refused to pay up and abruptly cut ties with him. Despite 4 long years of intense development and countless test flights, the IAE-33 fighter project kept running into persistent technical issues, and its future suddenly looked incredibly bleak. And even though there was no official order to scrap the project just yet, the fate of this aircraft was hanging by a thread. It had already become a true symbol of the Perón era. In September 1955, the Liberating Revolution broke out, a massive coup d'état against Perón's government led by General Eduardo Lunardi. That was when the single surviving prototype of the Pulqui 2 fighter finally got a chance to prove itself in combat. The exact details of its operational record remain a bit of a mystery today, but one thing is certain. When rebel forces captured the city of Córdoba, the IAE-33 took to the skies. It flew combat sorties alongside the Gloster Meteor F-4 fighter bombers based at the local aviation school. After successfully engaging forces loyal to the ousted president, the jet performed a spectacular low pass over the victory parade in Córdoba. However, once the military junta officially took power, the IAE-33 project fell into absolute disarray. The new government carried out massive purges, firing several key Air Force commanders. The situation got even worse when most of the talented engineers from Kurt Tank's team were forced to leave Argentina for good. They followed their boss to India, joining Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. Interestingly, this same team would later go on to design another well-known supersonic fighter, the HF-24 Marut. In a desperate bid to salvage the aircraft's reputation, drum up political support, and show off exactly what the IAE-33 could do, the Air Force planned an ambitious and highly risky record-breaking flight in 1956. The route ran from Córdoba to Buenos Aires and back, covering a distance of over 400 miles. The Pulqui 2 was expected to carry out a spectacular low-level attack, run over a training range near the capital, and then return to base using only internal fuel. Just so the pilot could breathe during the lengthy mission, they literally had to scavenge an oxygen system from an older British Gloster Meteor fighter sitting in the maintenance hangar. At first, everything went perfectly to plan. Lieutenant Bellado successfully flew the mission profile, including a live fire demonstration, maintaining an impressive average cruise speed of around 550 miles per hour. But on the return leg, disaster struck. The oxygen system suddenly failed. Battling hypoxia, the pilot somehow managed to execute a high-speed emergency landing. Unfortunately, the touchdown was just too hard. The landing gear could not handle the extreme stress and completely collapsed. The aircraft veered off the runway, sustaining structural damage so severe that the airframe was completely written off. This crash proved fatal for the program. Shortly after that tragic flight, the Argentine High Command canceled its order for 100 Pulqui 2 fighters for the Air Force. The military aircraft factory tried to salvage the program, promising that with finished wings, fuselages, and other components already sitting in warehouses, they could quickly assemble the first 10 aircraft. But finishing the rest of the order would take at least 5 long years. Time was not on Argentina's side. The Air Force was still flying 100 hopelessly outdated Gloster Meteor F-4s, bought back in the 1940s and practically falling apart from wear and tear. So, an alternative plan emerged: urgently acquire 36 modern Canadian-built Canadair Sabres. But that idea also fell through in 1956, simply because the Argentine Central Bank did not have the foreign exchange reserves to pay for such a massive procurement. Once it became clear that buying the foreign Sabres was not going to happen, the team at the factory started talking seriously again about putting their own Pulqui 2 into full-scale production. In fact, in 1957, the government even ordered the construction of a brand new prototype, despite the United States making Argentina a highly tempting offer of 100 combat-proven F-86 Sabres. Regardless, the Argentine engineers pressed on. The fifth prototype, designated the Pulqui 2E, rolled out in 1959. On the outside, it was almost an exact copy of the previous model, retaining its distinctive frameless bubble canopy. Flight testing kicked off successfully on September 18, 1959, with Lieutenant Roberto Stark taking the new jet up for its maiden flight. The continuous refinement of the IAE-33 Pulqui 2 finally paid off. Engineers managed to fix a major handling issue the aircraft suffered from during high-G maneuvers, and significantly boosted its flight range by integrating internal fuel tanks directly into the wings. It seemed like a real success story. But by that point, the design was already considered completely obsolete. On top of that, the project's reputation was hopelessly tainted by its close political ties to the ousted Juan Perón regime. So, the new Argentine government made a tough call, completely canceling the IAE-33 program just as it reached maturity. Instead of pouring more money into their indigenous fighter, the country decided on a more practical solution. Thanks to the American Mutual Defense Assistance Act, Argentina acquired 28 surplus F-86 Sabres from the United States for pennies on the dollar. In 1960, the story of Argentina's jet age miracle finally came to a close. The last working IAE-33 prototype only managed to fly 12 test sorties, serving as an experimental platform for transonic flight research before being permanently retired and put into storage. That was the absolute end of the line for the ambitious Pulqui 2 project. Shortly after, all the unique factory tooling and unfinished airframes were unceremoniously scrapped. And even though this aircraft never made it to full-scale production, the IAE-33 Pulqui 2 is still considered a major milestone in global aviation history. It was the world's first swept-wing fighter designed and built entirely in Latin America, from the drawing board down to the last rivet. Alongside its predecessor, the Pulqui 1, it gave Argentina a rightful claim as the 8th country on the planet to independently master such complex aerospace technology. So why did the project fail? Truth be told, it was doomed from the start, the classic result of a corrupt political system trying to fuel nationalist sentiment while the country itself was rapidly sliding toward economic collapse. President Perón was determined to turn Argentina into the dominant powerhouse of Latin America, and needed high-profile symbols of military might like the Pulqui 2 to pull that off. The story of this fighter even became the subject of a recent documentary where the entire development process is aptly described as an absurd adventure. This adventure perfectly illustrates the massive gap between the advanced aerospace manufacturing of developed nations and the makeshift facilities of developing countries. If you are looking for a real, long-term benefit from the massive funding poured into the Pulqui 2 program, there is really only one. This project essentially built Argentina's fledgling aviation industry from scratch. Those production facilities later evolved to eventually become Lockheed Martin Aircraft Argentina SA. Today, you can still see this piece of history up close. For several decades, the last surviving prototype of the IAE-33 Pulqui 2 sat outdoors on static display at the National Aeronautics Museum in Buenos Aires. However, this unique airframe has since been moved indoors to the Argentine Air Force Museum at Moran Air Base. There, it sits proudly on display right next to its older brother, the IAE-27 Pulqui 1. Both jets still wear their original paint schemes and markings, remaining forever as beautiful but tragic symbols of unrealized potential.